Good morning. I'm Rosemary Pena, President of the Black German Heritage and Research Association and adjunct professor of German Studies at the University of British Columbia at Vancouver. Today's conversation is the 25th in our All Black Lives Matter series. My colleague, Emily Fraser-Rath, and I, and our students here at Davidson College are delighted to welcome Dr. Robbie Aitken to our virtual classroom. So to get things going, I'll ask Emily if she will kindly introduce our special guest and share a little about our class before turning the program over to our students and Dr. Aitken. Emily?
Thank you, Rosemary. My name is Emily Fraser-Rath, and I'm a visiting assistant professor of German Studies at Davidson College, located just north of Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also the executive director of the BGHRA. We are so excited to be able to invite Dr. Robbie Aitken to our class, to Davidson College, and to the BGHRA today. Today is February 10th, 2022, and we, Dr. Pena, me, and most importantly, our incredible Davidson students are in our third official week together. This semester, Dr. Pena and I are so pleased to have another opportunity to work with Davidson students as we co-teach our second course together. German 351, or Race, Gender, Migration, asks us to employ a critical lens informed by Black German studies to questions of migration, belonging, and identity, as these big human topics intersect with Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, with the German-speaking world, and with the lives and experiences of the global Black German community. This class, like its predecessor, consists of three parts. It is first an exploration of the aforementioned themes as they are or could be handled in the field of Black German studies. Second, it is a community-based learning course as we support the BGHRA through our work and will feature our final projects in the BGHRA archive. And third, it is most importantly an opportunity for students and through these recordings, our broader BGHRA and Davidson communities to speak with people whose lives and work intersect with, influence, shape, and inform Black German studies. This series would not be possible without the generous support of the Dean Rusk International Studies Program Speaker Fund here at Davidson and the interim director of the program, Dr. Verna Case, as well as its program administrator, Meg Zweifel. I also cannot ever thank Meg Zwicky, our German Studies Department administrator, enough for her support, encouragement, and organization that truly has kept us going and remains a vital part of what we are doing. So to Meg, Mel, and to Verna, thank you. Before Dr. Pena and I fade into the background and turn things over to Dr. Aitken and our wonderful students, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guest. Dr. Robbie Aitken is a reader in history in the Department of Humanities at Sheffield Hallam University. His teaching and research interests center on the history of an African diaspora in Europe, German and European colonialism, modern German and European history, constructions of race, and concepts of Blackness and whiteness. We are looking forward to Dr. Aitken's talk at the upcoming BGHRA conference next week already, entitled The Last Forgotten Victims of National Socialism, Germans' Struggle for Recognition and German Colonial Amnesia, during which he will discuss how, quote, the Third Reich Germany's small resident Black community was subjected to increasing targeted policies and practices of persecution, which contained, at least the germs of a progressively racial annihilationism, end quote. For today's conversation, Dr. Aitken has provided our students and us with several primary source documents from the period between 1884 and 1945 for our students to reference during their conversation. So without further ado, I will step aside and turn things over to Dr. Aitken and to our students.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you for this session. Thanks very much to Rosemary and Emily for organizing all of this. Given we are a small group, I wonder if it would be possible for you guys just to very briefly introduce yourselves. I do hesitate to ask because I know my students would now frantically be pressing the leave Zoom room button. But if it does help, I can go first. And then if you're willing and able just to say something, name, why you're interested in German studies, that would be fantastic. Does that sound okay with everyone? Okay, well, my name's Robbie. I'm from Glasgow in Scotland. I'm a professor in imperial history here at Sheffield Hallam. As Emily said, my research interests span the relationship between Africa and Germany. To begin with, I looked at the development of a settler society in German Southwest Africa and the creation of a racial hierarchy. For roughly the last 20 years or so, I've been looking at the development of a Black community in Germany, particularly between the period 1884 to 1945, looking at how networks, political and social, developed, and how these networks and this community coped with the stresses of the Weimar period, and of course, with the Nazi period. So is anyone willing to volunteer and just say something very shortly about themselves? Don't all go at once. Just unmute yourself and just shout out.
Got it. Hi, I'm Carson Crochet. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm double major in German studies and Arab studies. And I'm particularly interested in German studies just to learn more about history, I'd say overall. And I find it very relevant today.
Brilliant, thank you. Who wants to go
Hi,
next?
I'm Rebecca. I'm a senior here at Davidson. I'm math major, German minor. I have never not been interested in German studies, I guess you could say. I've been taking German since kindergarten. So,
brilliant. Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Anyone else want to introduce themselves?
I'm Duncan Bacon. I'm from London, England. I'm a history major, and I do German studies mainly to learn the language, but also to gain a different perspective on Europe from the other side of the channel.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Steffi Coates. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm a biology and German double major. And I'm interested in German because my family is from Germany and I just took the classes for the language credit. And now I just fell in love with the department.
Great, that's great.
Hi, I'm Conrad Hector. I'm a history and German double major at Davidson. I'm a junior from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I primarily came into the department in my first year just to acquire skills in the language, and more of the literary courses have helped me stick around.
Great, fantastic.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a double major with biology and German studies, and I've always just been interested in the German history, and then I fell in love with the language.
Fantastic.
I'm Brayla. I'm a third year here at Davidson. I'm from Wyoming. I started taking German my freshman year just for a language credit, and I've had a lot of really wonderful professors that have encouraged me to stick around.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. It's really interesting for me to see the different combination of studies that some of you guys are taking on. It's much more narrowly focused, I'd say, in my experience in British universities. So well done to you all for looking at really wide variety of different academic disciplines. What I thought I'd do in this session with you guys is to focus on this period pre-1914. So specifically to look at a period from 1884, the onset of German colonialism in Africa, up until 1914 and the outbreak of World War I, to look at the development of a Black presence. For me, this is really a fascinating period because it's when Black residents and visitors become increasingly visible to German contemporaries and to one another. This is a period when the Black presence is really increasing. So on account of this, there's obviously an increase in the archival information that historians like myself can work with. And of course, as more and more materials become digitized, historical newspapers, passenger lists, memoirs, images, all of these really, I think, change what's possible in terms of recovering histories, lives, experiences. And that massive increase in information has helped me to have a firmer grasp of the scope, the size and the makeup of this Black presence. I think in order to understand what happens next in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, we need to have a firm grasp of the pre-war period, because that shapes quite a bit of what will happen next. So in this session, I wanted to do a number of things. I wanted to give you guys an insight into the types of materials that we can find, that we can use. That's partly why I sent some on in advance. Please don't worry if you haven't managed to get through them all. I know there was quite a lot to read. It's partly to help generate discussion, but it's also in case any of you is interested later on in looking more depth at this time period and some of the questions we'll touch upon, that you'll have materials that will hopefully help you to do that. So in terms of a plan, let me just briefly share my screen. So hopefully you can all see the slides. Is that okay for everyone? Brilliant. So here's the plan. I thought we would try and cover a number of questions, some of which might seem to be deceptively simple. So I want us to think about things such as, where do Black visitors to Germany come from? Why are there increasing numbers? What are the reasons and the routes that bring people? And how might these impact upon their stay in Germany? What conclusions, if any, can we come to the character and the makeup of this Black presence? Can we say anything about common experiences? And can we say anything about reactions from the German population at large, as well as from the German authorities to this movement of people? That sounds like quite a lot to cover. We'll see how we do with the time, but hopefully we can get through quite a bit of this. I'll say from the beginning, throughout our focus is largely going to be on people from Southern Africa, and in particular, people from Germany's African colonies. I want to try and keep things as open and interactive as possible. It'll be fairly boring if it's just me talking for 1 hour, so I'm afraid audience participation will be called for. I'd absolutely encourage you to ask questions as we go along, if there's things that you want to know more about, or if anything is unclear. So feel free just to shout out or to post in the chat. It's entirely up to you, but absolutely, if there's things you want to know or there's things that need explained, please do shout out. So to begin with, I'm going to make just a couple of general remarks about Germany's Black presence in this pre-1914 period. Remarks that I think we can also hold true for other European states, such as France, the United Kingdom, and also Austria, which I've started to look at as well. So this movement of people pre-1914 is unexpected. It's largely an unexpected consequence of globalization, of European imperialism, as well as Germany's emergence as a maritime power. It's these processes that create the routes, the opportunities, and also importantly, the transportation systems for Black men, women, and children, not just from formal and informal European colonial territories in Africa, but also from further afield, the United States, the Caribbean, and South America, to travel to Europe and to Germany. So empire is a key moment here. It creates a context for movements, and it leads to regular and improved shipping links between Germany and its newly formed African territories. We'll come back to those shortly. In terms of size, it's very difficult to say what the size of this presence is pre-1914. Frustratingly, there are no clear figures that exist, so we're really only working with estimates. I am fairly confident, though, in saying that we're talking about several thousand people, not several hundred. And I'll come back to why I think that's the case a little bit later on, but I would suggest that this Black presence is bigger than you might get the suggestion from when you look at the secondary literature. So several thousand people pre-World War I. What I'd like us to do is think about the roots and the reasons that bring Black men, women, and children to Germany. They are numerous. I'd like to see if we can identify some of the key ones together. And we'll do this through considering a few images. So let's start with this one. I'll give you maybe just a minute and a half to have a quick look at the image. A number of things I'd be interested in hearing back from you about. One, can you tell me what is it you're looking at? Two, can you think of the information that the image gives up? And three, can you work out why this person might have come to Germany in the first place? Because they represent a wider movement of people. So just very quickly, 1.5 minutes, and then you can start shouting out or posting in the chat. So anyone brave enough to tell us what they think it is that you're looking at?
Are we, sorry, are we looking at a gravestone?
Yes, why do you think it's a gravestone?
Because it says here, Hult, so here rests.
Absolutely. If we look at the symbols on it, there's a Christian cross. It says rest in peace, Ruhe sanft. She suggests also we've got here lies. And if you look at the information that's provided, that's fairly typical of the kind of things we might see on a gravestone. What information in addition can we gather about the person?
They were born, what is that, 8 years prior to the start of German colonialism in Cameroon.
Very good. Conrad, can you guess why this person might have come from Cameroon in the first place? So what's the link between Germany and Cameroon?
Wasn't, or is it, yeah, rather, Cameroon a former space of German colonialism? It was one of the earlier destinations.
Absolutely. So Cameroon was a former German colonial territory. So that's a very important piece of information we have. He comes from a place in Cameroon you might be able to make it out called Douala, which was a significant coastal town. What other information can we gather?
Well, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a cross and there's leaves and plants surrounding it. So, I mean, cross Christianity. I'm unsure what the leaves, though, would mean or what type they are.
Yeah, I think they might be trying to give a sense of the tropical background that this person comes from. This person clearly has also been baptized, which is one of the reasons why we have this permanent memorial. What else can we find out? Any other bits of information that you can see? What does this bit here say? Can anyone see with the cursor?
They may have been a prince.
Yeah, indeed. This is a prince. It's a prince who is called Equaladairo. Actually, to give him his full name, Prince Equaladairo is Songe Epe Equala Eyum Ebele Dairo, and he is from Cameroon. This tells us that we have a member of the coastal elite who is in Germany. He is buried in a place called Holthausen, which I suspect most of you have probably not heard of. Effectively, he lived in a place called Mulheim, which was in the Ruhr, a small town. If you look at the dates, can you work out how old he was when he died? I know it's not maybe a maths quiz, but see how you get on. Yeah, so if it would be 25, but I'm going to let you into a secret. This is not the original grave. The original grave was in a state of disrepair, but this was seen as an important historical monument. So they repaired it and they put his death as 1901 when actually it was 1891. So that would make him 15. Does anyone want to guess why a young boy around about 15 would have been in Germany in the first place? What might explain the youngster's presence in Germany?
I guess since he was a prince, could it be that he was sent there to be like to learn? Or...
Yes, very good, Olivia. Indeed, we can see a picture here of Prince Equala. This is him in his school uniform. He was sent to Mulheim in the Ruhr in 1890, died unfortunately within 6 months of having arrived there. But education, as we'll see, was a really key reason as to why people came to Germany in the first place, particularly from elite families. So I'll give you just a sense of this larger story of education. Migration for education or to undertake an apprenticeship was a really important reason for travel. And in particular, it is members of the Cameroonian and the Togolese coastal elite. So families like the Bells, who we can see here, 4 members of the Bell family, also of the Aqua family in Douala, or the Garbers of Anejo and Togo, who are taking the initiative to send their children to Europe for an education, particularly their sons. Can anyone think why these members of the elite would want their children educated in Europe? Anyone want to make any suggestions as to why they might be educated in Europe?
To learn the ways of the new colonial masters so that they could survive in the future.
There's definitely a bit of that. I think it is partly about cementing the relationship with the new colonial powers as a means of heightening their own political prestige, which they think will benefit them with traders and governments. But we should say that this is actually a long-established historical tradition. Members of the West African elite have been sending their sons to Europe for an education long prior to formal colonialism. And we've got to remember that some of these families will have relationships with Europeans through trade for decades and decades. And we can get a bit of an example of that tradition if we again come back to the photograph. So I'm just going to talk about these 4 young men here, starting with the man who's sitting down. This man is August Manga Bell. He was at the time the Bell leader of the Douala population. He's the son of a man called King Bell, and King Bell signs the 1884 Treaty of Protection with the Germans, which effectively enables the Germans to take over Cameroon. August Manga Bell goes to school in Bristol in the UK in the 1860s. He then will send his son, that's his first son, the young man at the back with his arm around his dad. This is Rudolf Douala Manga Bell. I don't know if anyone's come across him. He's the anti-colonial martyr who goes to school in Germany in Aalen in the 1890s and who will be hung by the Germans as a traitor in 1914. So we've got August Manga, Rudolf Douala Manga, and then we have Richard Manga Bell, who is another son of August Manga. He will go to school in Berlin from 1902 onwards. Very finally, we have this young boy sitting on his grandfather's lap. This is the first son of Rudolf Douala Manga Bell, Alexander Douala Manga Bell. He goes to school in Kiel, and he'll even start to study medicine in 1914 before his education is interrupted by the war. So this movement for educational purposes is actually quite important. I'm not going to talk about everyone in the image, but I do want to just pick out one of the young ladies, and that's the youngest lady here. This is Bertha Benge. She is one of only a handful of girls who come for educational reasons. And she will come to Berlin in 1899. She'll be educated for 12 years in the city, staying with the man with the beard, Edward Sheva, Cameroonian pastor for the Cameroonian mission. And she does very well at school. Her school progression is reported upon in the press. But there's no question of her ever going on to higher education. That's certainly something that the German authorities didn't want. So we'll come back to that very shortly. So education is a key reason for bringing people over. There are at least 100 to 120 largely young men who will be sent to Germany for educational purposes. Let's take some other images. So here are 4 other important routes of travel or reasons for migration. Can anyone pick any of them out? What can you see? Some are definitely easier than others.
We have the gentleman on the boat. It looks like he's in like a sailing uniform. I don't know what it says underneath, but that's, I think, an obvious one.
Absolutely perfect. Indeed, this is a Cameroonian youngster, Edo Rwana, who is part of the German maritime fleet. There are several dozen Africans who will largely come to the ports of Hamburg or Bremen and maybe spend a bit of time there, who work on German boats. The majority of Black sailors will not be from the German territories. They'll rather be from Sierra Leone or Liberia, where there's an established kind of maritime sailors who work for a number of European boats. In comparison with the British and the French, though, there are not many Black sailors on German ships. So that was the easy one. What about this one over here on the left? Can anyone pick out what that might be?
Some sort of entertainers troupe.
Yeah, indeed. This is a human zoo, an ethnographic exhibition, as they were also known as. And we can certainly say that several hundred Black men, women, children will come to Germany as part of a human zoo. They'll literally be put on display for German audiences, and they'll be expected to perform their customs and traditions. This is really a popular form of entertainment. It is mass market. And I think the image itself, if you look closely, it hints at some of the things that audiences might have seen. So we can see a number of musical instruments, which tells us that there was music being performed. You might be able to pick out a couple of the gentlemen who've got swords, so fight scenes would have been staged. If you look at this image, and it's a postcard that's used to, it's like a souvenir from the show. Is there anything significant you'd point out of this image? Any you pick out in this image? What about this gentleman here? Gentleman in the suit. This is Niall Bruce, or J.C. Bruce. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the document, but Niall Bruce first came to Germany in 1896 to be put on display as part of the Berlin 1896 colonial exhibition. He was a member of the Togolese elite. Niall Bruce was a very clever individual, and he understood quite quickly there was a lot of money to be made out of human zoos. So after leaving Berlin in 1896, he'll return to Germany 2 years later, this time bringing 30 members of the population group where he is the head, and he and his troupe will tour much of Europe, east and west, right up into 1914. And so he's one of a number of Black impresarios who realized that human zoos were big business. If you read the interview with Niall Bruce and the documents, I'm wondering whether it might have challenged your notions as to who actually participated in these shows and also their motivations. Because one of Bruce's motivations for being part of a human zoo was that it was a free ticket to Europe. He was already paying for his daughter to be educated in Germany and had planned to come over. But being part of the human zoo meant he didn't have to pay for his ticket. Instead, the Germans did. And when he got to Europe, he already had business cards printed so that when he was conversing with journalists, he was handing these out and trying to use this as a form of cultural power to make connections and networks. So hundreds of individuals, as part of groups or individually, will come to Germany as part of a human zoo. What about these people over here? Can anyone guess what's going on here on the right-hand side? Look closely at the gentleman in the white. That might give it away. Who could he be?
Is it like a missionary?
Yes, absolutely perfect. This is a member of the Catholic Palatine Mission. I will see dozens of African youngsters, again, almost entirely men and boys, being sent to Europe to be educated. So we've got a number of Togolese in Baden-Württemberg. We've got a number of Cameroonians in Limburg and Hessen. We have people with the Protestant mission in Berlin. And the 4 youngsters you can see there, all members of the Cameroonian elite. They are the first 4 to be trained by the mission in Limburg, to be then sent back to Cameroon to spread the word of God and to teach in mission training schools. So those 3 are probably the easiest. Does anyone guess about the youngster here at the bottom in the middle? What could he be? Let me give it away. This is probably one of the most important reasons for movement in the first place. This youngster is a servant. There are hundreds of servants who will be brought to Germany. Can anyone think what type of people will be bringing a servant to Germany and why would they be doing it? Who might have a servant?
Will it be the members of the coastal elite from the German colonies?
Some of the African families would, but it's not Africans who are bringing servants. Missionaries, traders, colonial civil servants. Pretty much every member of the white colonial society would have had at least one servant. Some of them will choose to bring their servants with them to Europe. This is a means of boosting their own social status, a means of prestige. We know this because a number of the newspapers will report on these men actively walking around town with their African servants, making themselves visible. In a number of cases, however, a trip to Europe will be sold as a means of a reward for good service. And in the case of the young man we can see here, this is Jombo Sankuru, who is from the Congo. In effect, this is why he's brought over. It's a reward for his good service. He is the servant to the governor of German East Africa, Hermann von Wissmann, and he'll come to Germany on at least 3 different occasions. Every time he leaves, he goes to a different part of the African continent. So it's a highly mobile group, and Sankuru himself is a highly mobile individual. So we've seen a number of routes and reasons that will bring people to Germany. School children, people to be educated, human zoos in particular, large numbers, sailors, servants in large numbers. In addition, we could add to this language assistance. When the Germans start to develop their colonial bureaucracy, they want to train future colonial civil servants. And one of the ways to do that is ensure that they know at least some of the local languages, customs. And we also have a handful of, I guess we could say, stowaways and adventurers who jump on a ship, simply wanted to come to Europe to experience it for themselves. So now I'm going to try and blind you with some statistics because I know how much my students love graphs. I was kind of frustrated for a long time when I would read the secondary literature and it would tell me how many Black people there were in Germany and how many lives could be recovered from the archival documents. Typically, the figure that was bandied about was 500. 500 lives from the entire period, 1884 to 1945. To my mind, that seemed way too low. So I spent about 8 months, about 4 or 5 years ago, just putting into database every single name or mention of an individual that I had come across, looking only at the period before 1914 and concentrating only on people from Southern Africa. So my database has no African Americans, it has no people from the Caribbean, and it has no one who's of a 2nd or 3rd German-born generation. Nonetheless, I could come up with well over 1,000 individuals. This is why I'm fairly confident that pre-1914, we're talking about several thousand people. There'll be many people that I simply cannot find and the historians can't find because of that lack of documentation. So the database, oops, let's just finish this off. The database is based on over 1,000 people. Have a quick look at it and see if you can come to any conclusions from my basic statistics. You could think about reasons for travel. You could think about gender background of visitors. Does anything stand out to you?
Well, the obvious one is the vast disparity between men and women who travel to Germany.
Absolutely, Duncan, you're completely right. There is a vast disparity between men and women. Does anyone want to guess why?
Well, since a majority of individuals came over, as it says, labor visitors, then obviously the muscular and like ability to physically do things matters.
I think that is absolutely the right reason. So if we look at the reasons that bring people to Germany in the first place, many of them automatically excludes women and girls. So in terms of educational visitors, I think there's about 3 girls who will be sent, or 4 girls who will be sent for educational reasons, because the patriarchal nature of many of the population groups that are involved in this migration process. In those cases, like Beata, who we saw in the image, her parents had no sons. So in order to keep up with their rivals, with other members of the elite, they sent their daughters. If we think of human zoo participants, there too, the vast majority of people are men. And by labor visitors, what I mean here are those who are language assistants. There are no female language assistants and servants. There are very, very few female servants. Does anyone want to guess as to why there might be very few female servants? I don't know if you know anything about kind of sexual relations in the German colonies and how that was viewed. The German colonial authorities are really scared of mixed sexual relationships. We have bans on mixed sexual relationships and mixed marriages in German Southwest Africa and in German East Africa. So it's almost unthinkable that young female servants would be put in houses with white men. So the overwhelming majority then are young boys and young men. All of which is to partly explain then why we have so few women coming to Germany in this period. Right, I'm going to blind you with one more graph and then we're done with graphs. So let's see how we get on with this one. What conclusions can we reach here? What do you think you can see? Shout out anything. You might come to different conclusions from me.
Well, you mentioned that a lot of missionaries were bringing back individuals. So I'm wondering if these are the countries like Cameroon that had more missionaries going there to begin with.
That's a good guess. I'm not sure there's many more missionaries, but if you look at the types of countries, does anyone know where those first 4 countries, what they were? What their connection to Germany is?
They're the German colonies.
Absolutely, yeah. So they are the German colonies. When I look at this, what surprised me was just how diverse this population is. There are people coming from over 20 different territories in Africa. I'd never expected that. We can see quite a lot of people coming from Sudan and South Africa. That's because they were coming to perform as part of ethnographic exhibitions. Those who are coming from the likes of Sierra Leone are likely to be sailors, Liberia, again, sometimes these are sailors, but there might be people who are coming for apprenticeships. The unknown, based on names alone, and I know that's not particularly accurate, I think we can probably say that the vast majority of them are from West Africa and probably from Cameroon. So as you picked out, indeed, these first 4 places are the German colonies. So we've got Togo, German East Africa, which is Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and for a very short time also Zanzibar, and there are a few people from Zanzibar actually come to Germany. It's German Southwest Africa, but actually there's very few people from German Southwest Africa who come over to Europe, partly I think because of the size of the population, and partly because lack of established connections with European trading partners, etc. The vast majority, as we saw, are coming from the likes of Cameroon, and particularly because we have these long established relationships between the coastal elites and Europeans. Within even this population of colonial subjects, there's quite a degree of diversity. So we have large numbers who come from these elite political and trading families who are in small but growing West African towns. The dominant proportion will be Douala, who are from the city of Douala. But we can also see a Christian elite from Victoria, which is now Limbe and Kribi. There are also Ewe and African Brazilians from Lomé and Aniho and Togo. There's kind of a range of people coming from the cosmopolitan port of Dar es Salaam in German East Africa. There are much smaller numbers actually coming from the African interior. So the likes of the Bali from the Cameroonian grasslands, or pastoral societies such as the Herero and Nama from German Southwest Africa, or the Maasai from German East Africa. There's a whole range of Christian converts, but we also have Muslims like the Waswahili from German East Africa, and a handful from the sultanates in northern Cameroon also spend time in Germany. So overall, I think we can say this is very much a heterogeneous presence. So despite it being heterogeneous, I think we can still pick out a number of overarching character traits. I've mocked up some prompts. I don't know if you want maybe a minute or two just to have a think as to what conclusions we could maybe come to some of those questions posed there. If I give you, say, 2 minutes, and then we'll see how we can summarize this together. Okay, does anyone want to make a suggestion as to what we can say about geographical origins of people who come to Germany?
The majority of them came from German colonies, and specifically Cameroon.
Yeah, so we have a diverse population. I was quite surprised that actually just under 50% come from the German colonies, but nonetheless, the majority are still coming from Cameroon and specifically from these coastal towns, particularly Douala. What about gender? I think we've already said this, but does anyone want to just remind us what conclusions we can come to the gender makeup of this presence?
Like we
Mostly,
said oh, sorry.
go,
No,
go.
Conrad, you. Okay.
Okay, mostly men, due to colonialism's racist anxieties about interracial mixing.
Absolutely. I think this hysteria over fears of miscegenation, particularly from the turn of the century onwards, really limits migration opportunities for African women and girls. And I think from my database, it's less than 10% of the entire names I could come up with were of women and girls. If we think about social status, is there anything we can say about that?
There was talk about the elite, especially those that were sending their children for education.
Yeah, I think it's quite surprising, actually, just how many people come from the elite, even within some of these ethnographic exhibitions. So the biggest ethnographic exhibition is the 1896 Berlin Colonial Exhibition, which now J.C. Bruce is part of it. And actually, most of those who participated, whether it's the Herero and the Nama, whether it's the Douala, whether it's those from Togo, are actually from elite families, which might tell us something about their motivation for being involved in the first place and what they hope to get out of being part of that. Even if we were to take servants, there's quite a few of those servants who come from elite families, who are placed with missionaries or who are placed with colonial civil servants as part of cementing a relationship with the hope of the family long-term benefiting from that. So I'm not going to say that everyone who comes is from the elite. That's most certainly not the case. But I think it is interesting to see just how many people come from these politically influential families. In terms of type of migration, I guess what I'm trying to think of there is this a forced migration or a voluntary migration? I'm not sure we can really come to many conclusions, but I don't think it's forced in the way that we've maybe seen migration of Africans to Europe prior to this time period. Even if we take servants, there are a number of servants who request to be taken to Europe when their masters come. We've seen in the case of human zoos that people might volunteer to be part of that as a means of actual enjoying mobility. At the same time, we could question what say do youngsters have when they're being sent by their parents to school in Europe? Is this their choice? Isn't this not their choice? So I think there's quite a lot still to be found out in terms of the type of migration. In terms of routes, there are a multiplicity of routes. We've looked at some of them, but there are other ways and means as to why people came. A bigger question, and for me also an interesting question, is this duration of stay. Thinking about the types of reasons as to why people came, does anyone want to make any suggestion as to the duration of stay, or if we can come to any conclusions? Think about some of the reasons for coming: servants, human zoos, sailors. How's that going to impact on the duration of their stay in Europe?
Most of the reasons for visiting are very transient, and like sailors come and go, servants can be sent back, human zoos move on to other locations. So I think it's perceived mostly as temporary by Germans.
Yeah, and I think it's also perceived as temporary by those who are coming over themselves. The overwhelming majority, we can definitely say, are transients. That's why we're not really talking about migrants, I don't think. I think that's the wrong term. I think we're thinking more in terms of visitors or sojourners as a better term. This is a population that's in constant flux. People are coming and going. Many are only staying a matter of weeks and months. If servants come over, it's for the duration of the stay of their European master. As Conrad said, if it's a human zoo, they are touring. They're often touring all around Europe, and often also going back to Africa before maybe returning a year later. If we think of sailors, clearly they are staying only a matter of days. Typically, the only groups who will be staying long-term are school children who might be staying a matter of years, or language assistants. However, we will see servants who, when they get to Europe, decide to break from their master and set out to forge their own life. Or in other instances, who might be abandoned by their masters and left to fend for themselves. And that's the same with people from human zoos who might break from the human zoo and try and create a life for themselves. All of which means it's difficult in this pre-1914 period for networks and communities to develop because people are constantly moving around. So well done, everyone. You've come to pretty much all the conclusions I was hoping for. It's diverse, vast majority of men, social status is mixed, but there are quite a few from the elite. Volunteer force, I think, is still up for grabs. There are multiple routes, and it's a population flux. Let me just add a couple of other elements to this. We should say that Black people are found all over Germany. They're not just in the big cities, Berlin and Hamburg, but you can find individual Black people in the tiniest of towns, in villages, and in cities throughout all of Imperial Germany. And this, I would say, is a reflection of the fact that the Germans who were involved in the colonial project, so the people who will typically bring young Africans over, missionaries, civil servants, military officers, businessmen, human zoo impresarios, they live throughout Germany. We can also say that many of these people are young. I would say typically they're maybe 19 to 20 years. Some of the service and school children could be significantly younger. In some cases, as young as 5. Bertha, who we saw in the photograph, was only 6 when she arrived. So they really are young people. It's a transient population. In part, that's because of these migration routes, but it's also linked to the reactions and the views of the colonial administrations, something we will come back to. What I thought we'd do now is think about common experiences. So I gave you a number of documents that you could look at if you want to. Based on that, I wonder if you want to have a quick chat with one another about what you could come up with when we're thinking about common experiences that Black visitors would have. Am I able to put you into Zoom rooms? Are you all going to protest greatly as my students would if I put you into a Zoom room? I don't know. Do you guys, is this a normal part of the course that you guys do in sessions or not? Okay, I'm going to put you in 2 Zoom rooms. Try not to just sit there in silence, but chat to one another. And I want to hear, what do you think are common experiences? You could draw upon the documents that I sent you, or if you've not had a chance to read them, just imagine what would it be like to be sent to a completely strange, different place. So let me try and work out if I can even put you into Zoom rooms. I'm not sure I can. Emily, are you able to create 2 Zoom rooms?
Rosemary might be able to. Let me see.
There goes my grand plan.
Rosemary, can you do it?
If not, we can try without the Zoom rooms.
I'm not sure I know how, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do without the Zoom rooms. Let me put the image back up. So does anyone want to make any suggestions as to the kind of common experiences that people would have had at this time period? You could draw upon the image, or as I said, if you've read any of the documents, is there anything that stuck out when you were reading them?
I think the most obvious experience would be they'd be treated as curiosities, because this time period, pretty much everyone had the opportunity to see Black people. They would have been stared at constantly, probably children trying to touch them, things like that.
Absolutely. Does anyone want to build on that? Did anyone get a chance to read the interview with Alfred Bell? There's a newspaper report in which he discusses his experiences. And at one point during the newspaper report, he stops and he points out to the journalist that a passerby has just made a racially abusive remark. Carson, you want to tell us something?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the article you're referring to, but there's one quote in which someone says, "I think the Germans are brutally rude." I think there's a part of this like language understanding, because it does seem that most individuals learn German and even English as well. And so you can hear what people are saying about you as they walk by. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a whole range of ways in which the Germans react to this increasing presence, from curiosity to verbal and physically abusive, to touching and talking, all of these kind of things, because as Duncan suggested, the German public is absolutely not accustomed to seeing people of color on German streets. And because we have this kind of highly racial stratification within the German colonies, there is also those stereotypes being created in Germany itself. And I think that creates a sense of superiority that many white Germans feel, and that they feel that they have the right then to either in a patronizing way treat African youngsters, or in a very much an abusive way. You can get a sense of that curiosity actually from the image in front of you, the way in which these three sailors, three of the first Cameroonians to actually reach Germany, are just being surrounded by lots of people. And that kind of racial representation as well, if you look at the faces, all three of the young Black men are drawn exactly in the same manner. There's no difference between the three of them. So that curiosity, I think, that sense of being observed the whole time, all of those who come feel that at one moment or another. Adding to that is the fact that in small towns and villages, quite typically, the local newspapers would take an interest in any young African who would be living in that community, so much so that their school report cards might actually be published in the press. I'm not sure how you guys would feel about your exam or essay results being in the local newspapers, but I certainly would not be very happy about that. So it works as an unsettling experience. And I can't remember which document it is, but there's one that features the young boy Bernard Apazi, in which he expresses this feeling of discomfort. I think that's probably document number 5 later on in the document when he talks about that. So clearly that's one of the key elements of their experiences. What else can we come up with?
I think it was mentioned that when they came to Germany, a lot of their movements were watched and they were like monitored by the government.
Yeah. I mean, how would that feel? I mean, that must be terrible. They're constantly, the people they're staying with are writing reports to the government about their school progress. More than likely, they will have to go to church, whether they want to or not. They will likely be either baptized or confirmed. Part of this idea of the civilizing mission. For some of them, this will be the beginning of a lifelong relationship with the church. And this is for them a positive experience. For others, it's just another example of this heavy-handed, paternalistic European control. And once they get back to the colonial sphere, they will immediately break from the church or the mission. So yeah, that's absolutely something as well. What else do you think? And you could even think about the very first image we started with.
I think it was document 3 that talked about dandyism and how aesthetic appearance of one's identity in Germany would be sort of an area of contestation. And so that sort of plays out in this image, I think, in their very uniform and composed sort of presence among a throng of what I'm assuming are white people.
That's a great point. That notion of aesthetic and styling, and which is sometimes dismissed as being dandyism. I think that's important, not just in this period, but it carries on into the 20s and 30s. Many images you'll see of Black Germans in the 20s and 30s, they're exceptionally well dressed. And this, I think, is partly to do with the status that they bring with them from the African continent. I think when we get to the 20s and 30s, it's also about trying to fight off effectively falling down the social scale, increasingly working and living in a working class milieu, but trying to keep up a different appearance. So I think the aesthetic is indeed exceptionally important. If I were going to suggest a few others, I think documents 1 and 2 really express a sense of culture shock about just how big places like Berlin and Hamburg were. I mean, we're talking about Berlin, which is a city which is, I think, well over 2 million by this point. Hamburg is coming up to be about 1 million, so masses of people. And I think that strikes as being almost quite frightening when you read the description of Paul Messi or Amr bin Nazur, the scale of the buildings as well that people are seeing. So I think there's a culture shock. There's definitely the sense of difference that we've talked about, the sense of scrutiny. Health is crucial. One of the things that many of the sources that we could find in which Black people talk about the experiences, talk about weather, rain, snow, the cold. And visitors' health, particularly their ability to withstand harsh German winters, is also frequently commented on in reports by the colonial authorities. They are susceptible to respiratory diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia, which continue to affect the German public at large, despite improvements in public health. And if you remember, we started with the grave of the young Prince of Kwala. He is one of well over a dozen individuals who will die in Germany, and frequently tuberculosis, pneumonia will be the causes. One other experience that is interesting to try and unpick is that of freedom. Freedom, we've said there's a lot of control in Germany, but in contrast to the control over the lives of these men and women in the colonial sphere, they can enjoy freedoms in Germany that they most certainly cannot enjoy in the strict racial hierarchy of the colonies. So physical punishment, which would be a day-to-day experience in the colony, is not something that they will experience in Germany. The ability to speak to members of the opposite sex who are white is not something that they necessarily have to fear to the same extent that they would definitely have to fear within the colonial environment. So there are other opportunities in Germany because the strict colonial rules don't follow them there. And that's a problem. That's a problem that will impact upon the views of the authorities towards this movement of people. So does anyone want to suggest what the German authorities made of this Black presence, particularly the German authorities based in Cameroon or Togo or German East Africa? What do you think those German colonial authorities made of the movement of Black people to Europe? Do you think they thought it was good or bad? 50-50. Anyone want to guess?
I would think that they would find some benefits to like temporary exchange, but never had the intention that individuals would stay for a long time, because then, yeah.
I think you're pretty much on the money. Anyone else want to add to that? What would the temporary benefits potentially be? Why might the authorities support some of this movement?
I mean, it could support colonialism more, and especially these individuals wouldn't have had rights in Germany at the time. So that wouldn't really affect German politics, but would enhance colonialism.
I think as long as the presence of Black men and women enables or helps the German colonial project. So the Germans need people to work as part of their bureaucracy, They need to train people who will work in craftsmanship in the colonies, particularly in the West African colonies, because the climate is such, there's never going to be a huge white population. So you're not going to find workers. They need trained African workers. So as long as this is beneficial, then they're happy to support that. So in theory, they're happy for Black men to be trained, to be educated, so that they can take up later roles in the employment of the German colonial administration. As Carson suggested, they definitely do not want people staying. That's the last thing that they want. And they don't want any Africans studying at university. Overeducated Africans are deemed to be a real threat. So even within about 4 or 5 years of the empire being created, the colonial administrations in Africa are questioning the benefits of migration. This is because it's very difficult for them to monitor visitors' movements. It's difficult to monitor visitors' actions. They can't take over complete control. They cannot observe all the time who people are meeting, the types of ideas that they're being exposed to, such as democracy, or worse still, socialism. And they can't stop youngsters writing back to family and friends on the coast of Africa. Because that's happening, letters are being sent back and forth. This is starting to have a destabilizing influence on the politics back in Africa and the colonies. And so what we're going to see is increasingly migration restrictions being brought in. Youngsters like Alfred Bell, so the guy I think is in document number 3, he is active in passing on letters from King Bell, letters of protest, and of bringing this to the attention of members of the German authority. So they're publicly promoting the interests of their home territories against the German colonial regimes. Sometimes they're working with anti-colonialists. Alfred is writing in his letters about the poverty he sees in the streets of Germany. It comes as a real shock to him that there are poor Germans. He is writing about some of the ideas of socialism, and that's deemed very much as being a threat. And in the newspaper article, if you've read it, there's one moment when he's sparked into life, according to the newspaper reporter, when I think the suggestion is made by the reporter that Cameroon belongs to the Germans. And Alfred replies by saying belongs with a question. Yes, it belongs to them in a way. They have the money, the guns, and an army, and therefore having the might, they have the right. But do not imagine that the natives, from my Uncle Bell downwards to his humblest subject, feel that the Germans are the masters. This is printed in the newspapers. And this sparks a real fury in Cameroon, so much so that Alfred will eventually be deported back to Cameroon, and that he will be named when migration restrictions are drawn up. The Germans want to prohibit individuals like him, or you can see an image of the infamous Mpondo Akwa. This is the gentleman well-dressed on the left-hand side, who also protests against German colonialism. These men are dismissed as being semi-civilized, half Europeanized, as a threat. So I know we're probably rapidly running out of time, but I'm going to try and draw things to a close. So migration restrictions will be brought in. A series of restrictions pre-1900 and then again after 1900. But despite these restrictions, Black men and women from the colonies and elsewhere continue to reach Germany with or without permission to do so. The vast majority, as well as all other Black visitors, will return home by the outbreak of World War I. There are some Black people taking up residency through choice or necessity, but they are an exception. These are the people that will form the core of a Black community post-World War I. It's not migration restrictions that change the Black presence from transient to stable, it's World War I. When it breaks out, all Black people who are in Germany are stuck there for at least 4 years. Post-World War I, the Germans lose their territories, they're taken away from them. They're put under the protection of the French and the British primarily, who do not want any of these Africans returning home. So effectively what we'll see is that people who arrive as visitors are turned into residents on account of the war and the Treaty of Versailles. But we'll also see that the Black presence is much smaller. Okay, I'm going to say thank you very much to you all for working very hard. I'm not sure you realized you were going to have to put all that time and effort into working, but I want to thank you for doing so. I don't know if there's time for any questions, but if you have any, feel free just to shout out, or you can post them in the chat. And it doesn't have to be about this period. If you want to ask questions about the periods beyond, I'm happy to answer in that as well.
Sadly, Robbie, I think we're going to have to invite you back and invite our students to your talk at our conference, of course, to ask further questions because our class time is ending. But in closing, I'd like to say a big thank you to you and to Emily and our students, and importantly, to Davidson College for making so many important conversations possible. Today's recording will soon be among the others on our All Black Lives Matter playlist on our YouTube channel. Please join us from February 17th to the 20th, 2022, when the 5th BGHRA conference will be hosted virtually by Africana Studies at Rutgers University, Camden. Our conference not only honors Black History Month, but importantly, documents and celebrates the 10th anniversary of the BGHRA. Our theme is All Black Lives Matter, Black Germany and Beyond, and registration is now open at tinyurl.com/BGHRA 2022. Visit our website at bghra.org for all of the amazing details. Proceeds from your purchases at our conference swag shop will support Black German artists and our graduate student-led initiatives. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel, and to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. A new series of events, Black Germany and Beyond, will begin right after the conference, so stay tuned. We hope that you've enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Robbie Aitken as much as we have. And until next time, we thank you again for your time and attention.